Hi, this is Professor Koenig, and we are moving along on our introduction to communication theory, and we are talking about today chapter 20, and this is another chapter in our thoughts on the public, and we've talked about rhetoric, and we've talked about Burke, and the narrative paradigm is connected to much of how we think about the world as a greater society. So think about publics, even though rhetoric seems like I'm just talking at a group of people in like a town hall. That's not all it is, right? It's everyday conversation. It's everyday interactions with more than one peoples. It's how we function as communicative beings. So that's a bigger picture. But the narrative paradigm is not a theory. So Walter Fisher, he said this is not a theory because a paradigm is bigger than a theory. A theory is an idea, right? Like I think this could be right. Walter Fisher really enjoyed his thoughts on narrative, and he said it's not a theory. This is the changing. This changes the whole scope of everything. And so a paradigm it's larger than a theory. If you've ever heard the phrase like a paradigm shift, it's like everything from this point on, once we've established this to be a truth with a capital T, the whole way we think about communication, the whole way we think about public communication should change. Did it? Well, you decide for yourself how you feel about Fisher and Fisher's theory about the narrative paradigm. There's a lot of good information associated with the narrative paradigm. So a narrative paradigm, Fisher says basically humans are natural storytellers. Can we argue with that? I don't think so. I think that he was onto something, and I think that most theorists in communication would agree with him. And I think most people would agree with him. When we talk about anything, we tell a story. We like to tell stories. It's just the way that we are. Decisions about a story's worth are based on good reason. So decisions about what we want to talk about, right? It's based on good reasoning. And it's personal reasoning, but we consider it good reasoning, right? So I'm going to tell these components of a story versus the other components of a story. Well, why? I make a decision, right? And if you recall, Burke said that human beings are decision makers. The narrative paradigm says good reasons are determined by matters of history, biography, culture, and character. So when we decide what we're going to sort of like, what is our reasoning for these stories and sharing these stories, we have to think about the notion of context. So who are we? What's our history? What's our culture? The narrative paradigm assumes that narrative rationality is affected by all of these sort of personal attributes. Material that appears persuasive is specifically relevant to us. So going back to some of our rhetoric, we said a lot of it is about identification, right? That's what Burke said. So the narrative paradigm might tie to that, saying, well, if it's specifically about me, then I am identifying with certain components of a story. Think about some of your favorite books or favorite movies. Why are they your favorites? They tell a good story. Why? Because you think it's a good story. Why? You tell me, right? Because you can identify with the characters. You can identify with the situation. It's a history. You can identify with the history. So identification for this narrative paradigm fits nicely. Fourth assumption of the narrative paradigm asserts that people believe stories insofar as the stories seem internally consistent and truthful. So if I think that you're full of garbage, I don't really abide by your perception of life or who you are or your ethical characteristics, credibility. So I need to believe that the things that are coming out of your mouth and the situations that are being discussed and the communication situations are genuine and truthful. Finally, Fisher's perspective is based on the assumption that the world is a set of stories, and I love that idea, right? We are all just telling stories. We are all stories ourselves, and we interact and we interchange and we ebb and we flow, and the stories meet and they break apart, and we form new stories with new people, and that's really at the heart of this narrative paradigm. So some of the assumptions of the narrative paradigm. So narration is often thought as simply as a story, but for Fisher, narration is much more than a plotted story. In Fisher's perspective, it includes any verbal or nonverbal account with a sequence of events. So really, narration is symbolic actions. So even just sitting here watching me, to some extent, could be a narrative, right? Why are you sitting here staring at me? Well, you're in this class. Why are you in this class? You're a communication major or you're not. Well, what is your major? Why? And what do you want to do with that? Where did that come from before? I mean, it's endless, right? It's endless. It can go on and on and on, the connections to narration. A narrative rationality is a standard for judging which stories to believe and which to disregard. So we've got these traditional tests of rationality, including claims of facts and relevance. Whether all relevant facts have been considered, whether arguments are internally consistent. Narrative rationality is not like that. So in contrast to traditional logic, where we can say, I have got standards for what is truth and what is not truth, narrative rationality operates on the basis of coherence and fidelity. Coherence is a principle that says, I can relate to the internal consistency of the story. So even if you are a liar and you're telling me a story, I might believe you. Maybe I know you're lying, but I still might believe you if there is internal coherence. So judging a story's coherence, the listener would ask whether the narrative seemed to hang together in a consistent manner. Okay, so not to get political, but I just read about this. Depending when you're watching this could be a long time ago. President Trump came out and said that President Obama had wiretapped the Trump Towers. So some of us would say, okay, coherence. That story doesn't fit together because Obama didn't go to Trump Towers and with like a bunch of bugs and like set them in the phones and stuff like that. He doesn't even know how to do that. He is not an electrician. He doesn't work for the FBI, nor did he ever. So I would say that there's no coherence to that. It's not stringing together for me. Others who want to believe that this is true, and I'm sure many people do and did, would say, yeah, I know Obama could do that because he has a degree in law, because he's whatever pieces that work for those people who want to believe that story, want to believe that narrative, they could piece it together internally to make it fit the ideas that they already have, to make it coherent to them. Structural coherence is the type of coherence referring to the flow of the story. So does it start at the beginning and end at the end? Does it start somewhere in the middle and go back a few times? Because if I'm trying to find these pieces to fit together, maybe the structure isn't beginning to end. Maybe the structure is this started in the middle and I kind of backtrack here and then I go forward and then I go backwards, and that all makes sense to me. That's a big puzzle and it all is fitting together. So that's structural coherence. Material coherence refers to the degree of congruence between one story and other stories that seem related to it. So if you've heard several stories about why two friends of yours have stopped speaking, of all the stories but one attribute attribute the problem to one friend having misled the other, causing an embarrassing situation, you are unlikely to believe the one unique story. So we're talking about material coherence, structural coherence. Characterological coherence refers to the believability of the characters in the story. So do I believe that the characters would do something like this? Do I believe that Obama would go to Trump Towers and bug his phones? Well, I don't know Obama. I know that he was trying to stop him from winning the election, right? I know that he was on Team Hillary. So maybe that's in his character. I'm not sure. I don't know him that well. Others would say, no, that's not the way Obama is. He's not that kind of a guy, right? Or some maybe, yeah, he's shifty and he's shady and he probably did that, right? So that's character coherence. Fidelity is the other critical standard for assessing narrative rationality. It's the truthfulness or reliability of the story. And there's so many ways that we think a story is reliable. Who's telling the story? What is the representations in the story? What is the purpose of the story? All of these things are a part of the fidelity. So what does this all mean? How are we putting this all together? How we assess truth, how we assess the world, how we assess our relationships with others are based on these narratives. That's the assumptions in this paradigm, that that we see these patterns of reasoning and they exist in stories and narratives, and we either go with them and we believe them and it's coherent to us in various forms, structurally, characteristically, or it's not, and then we don't believe it. And then we get into a whole host of other psychological issues when we believe or don't believe something, right? And that's where persuasion comes in, belief, right? And motivation. And now let's tie it back to rhetoric, right? Because that's the purpose of rhetoric, the act of persuasion, right? The available means of persuasion. And so this narrative says that we're all storytellers. We tell stories. And they're truthful or they're not truthful. And we mean them to be truthful or we mean to be deceptive, right? Even when we mean to be truthful, we can be deceptive at the same time. And who's believing us and why are they believing us? And why are they identifying with us as others in our own story? And where all our stories sort of overlap and are intertwined. This is a really thick, very rich paradigm, but a fascinating one nonetheless. And there's, some issues with it, as there is with all of these. So the narrative paradigm has been faulted for failing to be consistent with some of the other claims that Fisher had made. So Fisher made some claims and then sort of changed his mind a little bit, which is okay. I hope that we realize, I want to point that out because I hope we realize as scholars that you come up with a theory or a hypothesis and you start doing research and you find that you were wrong. And that's great. It's great to find out that you're wrong, because if you're wrong and you admit it and you put it out there, that's how other scholars build on your work. And really, somebody like Burke or Fisher too, they don't come around all that often. Most of the time, it's a theorist building upon another theorist. And with rhetoric, theorists have been building on Aristotle's works since millennia, right? And they will continue to. And it's all a part of the rhetorical tradition. All of these sort of overlap and fit. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. It's challenging, but at the root of it, we're all storytellers. And I just told you a very long story, and if you need any more assistance, let me know.